All right, Nina, thank you very much for coming on the channel, and I really appreciate this. Now, this is sort of this is my own personal love affair with music, and particularly like glam, punk, anything from the mid 1970s to the late 1980s. I consider that my personal golden age of music, and I think,
Mine as well.
yeah,
Mine as well.
okay.
And while I'm remembering it, it would have been Sylvain's birthday
Mm-hmm.
today.
Oh, okay. Right.
He
So
was born on Valentine's Day.
okay, so that's now that's a really interesting factoid there. So let me ask you, let's just since you brought up Sylvan, how do you feel about this year's inductees to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
I visited the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame actually when I was doing a research trip, and it kind of brought all the things about why we didn't need a corporate rock and roll hall of fame to mind. Rock and roll doesn't need corporate sponsorship. Rock and roll is something that you feel in your heart. So as far as I'm concerned, the New York Dolls always were in the rock and in one's passionate rock and roll hall of fame. I hate what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame stands for.
Mhm.
I'm deeply saddened that they've asked that it's happened now. The New York Dolls have been voted in when only David Johansen's left alive. I just think that is so sad.
Yeah, yeah, I totally understand it. And the thing about it is the New York Dolls, they influenced the people that influenced pretty much everyone else. So they're kind of I would consider them a seed band, sort of a core band like MC5, obviously Stooges, and they're even pre that. So I would consider them, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I would consider them probably the antecedent to everything that exploded after that. And I think that's sort of for people who don't know that kind of history, that seems to be what I would think would be kind of a common understanding of the history. Am I correct in thinking that?
I think you're correct in thinking that. I think they were much more accessible in some ways than say the Stooges and the MC5. They were much more fun and frolicsome, and I think there's quite a lot of T-Rex influence in there, Mort
Hmm.
Bolan. But yeah, they were incredibly important. They kind of, at the point that the Dolls got going at very early 70s, they blew the cobwebs off rock and roll, which had gotten very ponderous, apart from, well, the MC5 and the Stooges would they have been on the wane by that point? So the Dolls shook things up a bit, which is what rock and roll is supposed to do. Rock and roll is supposed to be uh, I guess it's supposed to change the direction of youth culture. Youth culture isn't supposed to stay still. It's not supposed to behave itself. It's a series of wrenches and jolts. And that's what the Dolls were. And that's why something corporate like the Rock and Roller Hall of Fame actually doesn't have anything to do with it. What, people sitting at their table applauding politely. I mean, I'm sure they'll all get up and jump when they say the New York Dolls name because what, 45 years later, it's okay to do that?
Hmm. Yeah,
This would have made Kane, Arthur, and Sylvain, and Johnny and Jerry so happy. But I mean, Johnny and Jerry were considered the troublemakers. They got up the corporate nostrils, so to speak. So they wouldn't have been allowed in there. And more power to them because rock and roll is supposed to be for the misfits and the outsiders, not for people that were acceptable or have, I don't know. You know what I mean?
oh, absolutely, I know what you mean. So you brought up Johnny, and so Johnny Thunders. I mean, personally, I loved I love the New York Dolls, and I particularly loved Johnny Thunders. I loved everything that you know the whole package of what he was, singer songwriter, excellent music. The idea of being an influencer before anybody knew what an influencer was, the sort of musician's musician. Like you had to go at least two or three levels deep in your music to even know who Johnny Thunders was, and that's not to put a slight against Johnny Thunders. It's sort of like almost like a hierarchy in terms of talent and in terms of power. And so what can you tell me, for those folks who haven't read anything of yours, what can you tell us about, your interactions with Johnny Thunders, what you think about Johnny Thunders, just anything you can throw out there.
Well, I guess that if the Dolls were this great turning point in rock and roll's development, then Johnny was kind of the guitarist that did much the same. I mean, there's sort of, what you said about being the guitarist, that's very true, but it's a secret hierarchy, and Johnny, I think, was the king of a secret hierarchy. And I've put this in articles. In many ways, he was like a James Dean figure. So the live fast, die young thing, unfortunately, he lived that and died that, and he was that in his soul. He was an incredibly poetic character. I think, when you look back in history and you look back at the sort of wilder talents, say like Rimbaud, the French poet, they are unnerving people to meet because they push boundaries. But when you finally come into contact with them, it's like lightning. He was incredibly charismatic, Johnny.
Interesting. So, I mean, what could you share about, just like you just mentioned, about him, being in his presence and the whole lightning in the bottle kind of situation? What kind of interactions would you be comfortable in sharing, or for the folks out there that may not be? I'm trying to draw people to Johnny Thunders and this kind of music.
I think what's difficult to explain, say, with the Doors, everybody knows, because there's footage and because there's that movie, how exciting Jim Morrison was on stage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Johnny wasn't the equal of Jim Morrison or Jimi Hendrix, but there isn't that much footage later on to show you that. And sometimes when a character is lightning in a bottle, they don't always behave themselves in recording studios. I think in a way, Johnny is the spirit of unrest and rebellion. He was definitely two people. There was the character of Johnny Thunders, who was like the Jesse James of rock and roll, or the James Dean. And then there was who he was, which was Johnny Gonzalez, which was quite a shy, reserved guy from Queens.
How interesting. And I've heard that before. Someone is obviously once they go on stage, they turn into this completely different transfigured person, and this metamorphosis happens. But I oftentimes think that talent can be very damaging if it's much bigger than a human vessel can kind of hold, and that kind of what I get from Johnny Thunders. And being at the tail end of the punk scene, coming into my teens in the late 1980s, for a brief time I lived in New York City, and I was fortunate enough to go to the original CBGBs and to kind of soak in St. Mark's and Tompkins Square and all that, the remnants of what that scene was. I understand that I saw a lot of bands at that time that you don't understand the energy that you could see live versus what an album or even a live album could convey to someone. So I understand what you're saying. However, there is one performance, and I put it on my playlist of Johnny Thunders in particular. I think it was Chatterbox he did, and it was in Long Island.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saw that that performance, and he is just I mean, so ahead of it, at least a decade to 15 years ahead of his time. If not for his guitar playing, this style of guitar, the kind of distortion he used, but also the presence and the movements. No one really thinks about it nowadays, the 1970s, what they were actually doing versus where the Dolls were at that time. There's nothing like that, and it's just...
No. I think actually that performance that you're talking about, it was that late night TV show. Was it Midnight Special?
I think it was Midnight Special, which, by the way, has just a treasure trove of brilliant bands. But they are just, yeah, I think it's Midnight Special. And it was just the performance, it gives you chills the first couple times you watch. I've seen it so many times now it doesn't, but the first couple times I watched it, it just blew me away. So,
Well, that's kind of, I wish that that could be played on here, but that's what I'm talking about that level of excitement and energy. And it was just amazing. The other thing that I wanted to say is that a friend of mine who's a very good guitarist in his own right, it was John Perry from The Only Ones, who played with Johnny as a guest many times. And he explained to me, because I'm not a guitarist, that what Johnny did was very simple. You put the guitar in the Marshall amp and you whack everything up as high as it goes. But it was like that Johnny could kind of surf that distortion. So simple as it may have been, it's incredibly difficult to duplicate.
yeah, that's oftentimes the what the argument is made about technical musicians versus someone like a really good blues musician is that, something really basic cannot be duplicated. It's sort of that you either have it or you don't. It's like with a singer. You either captivate people with your voice or you don't. It's very, there are techniques that singers can use to sort of, technically improve, but you either have that thing that can capture someone or not. And I think the guitar is, to me, it seems like such a romantic instrument because it's one of those few things like the voice but it's a piece of technology, and yet so much can be done with it that it truly does exhibit the sort of inner world of the person. And to me, it is kind of poetry. Like you're saying, surfing. I love that when you use that phrase of you surf the distortion, and it really is a matter of that. And no one, that he was so cutting edge, with the Dolls, certainly their look that everyone comments on, but their sound was cutting edge, their ethos was cutting edge, but the Johnny Thunders himself and his playing was just, I don't know, there's nothing like it. And I can see why you'll see really big bands going into the 80s, like the heavy metal bands, the hair bands. You'll catch them with sometimes like a Sid Vicious t-shirt, but you'll catch some of the folks, like Guns N' Roses, you'll see them wearing like a Johnny Thunders t-shirt, so they get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think was it Duff that covered Memory? I mean,
I think it was, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
He's got his own. I believe he has his own podcast now, or at least he drops in every now and then on the Chris Jericho podcast. So that's kind of cool. But so you have the Dolls. You have this sort of transition period. They're kind of a transition band. They kind of help set up, like you said, they are kind of pre-Stooges. They are kind of, in that sort of transition kind of period there, and they kind of set up what became the late New York and then London punk scenes, and then that led to the whole avant-garde new wave, and then from there it spilled on out into everything else. What is there any insights that you can give, especially being in London, not that early. I don't know how far back it goes, but what are your insights to that scene? Because I'm fascinated, because I was, like I said, I experienced the far outer edges of it in New York City in the late 80s. So, yeah.
Oh, what do you mean? Do you mean when once sort of Malcolm McLaren, there's all these claims, aren't there, that he tried to help the Dolls at the end of their career. Now, he genuinely loved the band. And I interviewed him, and he was actually very nice because he was talking about something that was still special to him. But I love the way David Johansen said he wasn't our manager, he was our haberdasher. So it's cross claims, but McLaren took certain aspects of the Dolls and transposed them onto the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, that's pretty apparent, and I knew about McLaren being having some. I thought he was the manager, but I'm glad you cleared that up for me. I knew about McLaren having his interactions with the Dolls and that transferring with the shop transferring over into the Sex Pistols and trying to make the Sex Pistols a kind of Dolls-esque thing. And obviously the Sex Pistols became in their own right their own phenomena, obviously their own thing. Absolutely. And we can get in that if that's something you're interested in. But
Not really, but I mean, because the dolls were what I loved, and I didn't much. I don't know. The people in the Sex Pistols, maybe aside from Johnny Rotten, I think were good players, and Steve Jones, as we now know, tried to play like Johnny. Johnny was just so hugely influential. One could write a book about all the people that Johnny has influenced and in what ways. So, yeah, he's there at the rebirth of rock and roll and punk. But I didn't have a great interest in the Sex Pistols, I have to say, because I did see the tricks that Malcolm had borrowed from them. So
that's very
yeah.
interesting. That's interesting you say that, because I remember seeing the Rolling Stones back in the late 90s or maybe the early 2000s, and they did the 100 most influential rock bands of all time, sort of a kind of summary of the 20th century, and they put the Sex Pistols at #1. And I thought at the time Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers should have been, if not #1, at least in the top 3, and so should have with and or the New York Dolls in the top 3, because if the Dolls influenced the Pistols, then obviously they need to be higher up. If you're truly doing a sort of top 100 of who's who in terms of a hierarchy of who is the most influential, if you're influencing the bands that are influencing the bands, then you need to be, and that's why I talked about he's kind of a king, you have to be up there. And it's like a secret order that you either had to have lived it, you had to have known some sort of insider knowledge about it. That's why I was so interested in talking with you, because like I said, I was an outside observer. I loved music just for music. I'm not a musician. I don't know anything beyond a little bit of maybe bass tablature, and that was just, a kind of fleeting thing. I just love music, and I can point out and I can see when there's pure talent. Obviously, the Dolls exhibited that, and obviously musicians who have the technical know-how in the background, they obviously followed that as well. So it's interesting that you said that about the Pistols, because not oftentimes when people bring up the Sex Pistols, it's immediate praise, it's immediate fan worship, and that's kind of cool. You went the complete opposite direction.
But I would say I absolutely agree with what you're saying 100%. And I think the fact that you loved music qualifies you to speak about it from a genuine place. The fact that Rolling Stone put the Sex Pistols as their #1 most influential band shows that they are part of the corporate mindset that holds hands with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They don't know any better. They're not going to open the door to the secret hierarchy, because the secret hierarchy is about joy and expression, not how many units you sell. And sometimes the joy and expression can mean so much more. You may not sell all those units because the people in the Midwest didn't understand the Dolls' clothing, but it doesn't mean that they weren't the most influential thing. I'm sure that graveyards are full of influencers that nobody's ever heard of, the best poet, the best short story writer, because they were so ahead of their time.
And yeah, that's like you said, it's kind of a common theme, kind of a common downfall in all of the arts, where not a downfall, but it's artists that are either ahead of their time and they're sort of placed out of sync, so to speak. I almost feel like had the Dolls, but it's kind of, I guess, now that I'm thinking this through and saying it aloud, had the Dolls been around in the 80s, they would have been ready for them, but the 80s would have never happened had the Dolls not did their thing in the early 70s. So it's sort of this weird paradox that they can't escape from.
I'm just thinking of something. There's always the secret hierarchy. I remember when Madonna did her sex coffee table book, and people were saying how wild and original it was, but it wouldn't be wild and original to somebody that knew the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, because then you're just thinking, oh my God, that's all that she's done here. And although I have a lot of love and respect with David Bowie, he again took from the underground. And it was the same with the Vogue scene as well that came out of New York. I don't know if you've seen Paris is Burning, which is a very good documentary. So the people in the above strata that have the corporate support have always taken from the underground.
That's so that's interesting and insightful, and I like this idea of this secret hierarchy, because there truly is. And even in the later punk scene, there were players that never got the, you like nowadays you had the Green Days and you had the bigger bands, but they were influenced by SST bands from Los Angeles, like, obviously Black Flag, but even Black Flag was influenced by, and you can go down this secret history ladder that you either have to be there at the time or you have to be a true music lover and do the research. And that's, I like that you're applying almost this esoteric side to this whole thing. And by esoteric, I mean you're one level removed from what a popular understanding of what's actually going on, because I don't think a lot of people, and I don't mean to be dismissive of a lot of music people, and a lot of music people just enjoy music for what it is, and they just, that's all it is to them, is it's a release, it's whatever. But for that music to come about, like I say about film, a lot has to happen, and a lot of things have to fall into place at just the right time. And it's all about timing in particular, and that's the thing about the Dolls is, I suppose, they were there at the right time. Although I wish they would have gotten a bigger amount of success, and perhaps, sort of posthumously the band as a band, not, for the surviving member, but, perhaps, there'll be a resurgence of this. I noticed on YouTube and everything, there's a lot of folks picking up on a lot of great popular music. It would be a great phenomenon for people to pick up on music that was influencing the people that was popular music in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What do you think that would ever fly?
I know from direct experience that I hear quite a lot week in and week out from younger people, and that makes me so happy, just asking me about Johnny or my books or my contributions. And more females are doing that. They're just so interested in that bit of history.
Yeah, that is very, very wonderful. So about your books, what, just kind of diving off here about you, kind of what, I've read your page, I've read some of your stuff, but for people that may not be interested and maybe they want to get interested in your stuff, what got you into music, rock, and then particularly Johnny, the Dolls, the sort of early gelling of what became known as punk? What got you going?
I always felt like an outsider. I had a very unfortunate family background that made me feel that way, and I had to find a form of expression, and it turned out to be writing. But the only things that have ever interested me have been the secret hierarchies. And in a sense, if Johnny was the guitarist, I ended up becoming the person that wrote the books for that wanted to know about that. So I've always been slightly obscure, but my books have become really important to people, and people write me the most beautiful things. But can I get a mainstream book deal? No, I can't. And I really want In Cold Blood to be back out on paper. And if I had copies, original paper copies of that book, for the amount of times people ask me, I get 2 or 3 requests a month, I would be rich. Mm-hmm. But I had an agent a couple of years ago who went around all the publishing houses in New York, and he was told the same things over and over again. Oh, we're just about to do a big Led Zeppelin book. Yeah, we're doing something on the Stones. And the other thing that people have also said, even though I really like the book Please Kill Me, mm-hmm. I think it's a great overview of a scene, but a few people have said, oh yeah, we don't need a Johnny Thunders biography because we've got Please Kill Me. They've still not woken up to the secret hierarchy. Maybe they never will. Maybe some things just fall. Maybe some things are too ahead of their time or too challenging.
Well, I think, respectfully, I hope you're wrong, and I think it would be wonderful if someone were to listen to this and pick that up. I mean, that would be, and I think that what you write, the way you write it, your sort of your signature in time in terms of rock and roll, in terms of that early kind of, it was glam punk and all that, and it wasn't what it was going to become quite yet. You were right in the middle of all that. And I think, yeah, a secret hierarchy is incredibly important, particularly for writers, because the writers are the ones that can articulate something that's almost, you can't articulate it. And that's what, why I'm interested in talking with you. One, I just, anybody that's close to those kinds of, it's particularly the younger version of me, that all of this was still new. I hadn't read any of those things, that you're talking about. Any of the novels, any of the books, any of the histories, I haven't read by that point. So it was just raw at that point. But now that I'm getting older, I'm starting to read more about it and get into the history and understand it. It's I think it's something that's worth preserving, and I think your work is part of that hierarchy. And the thing about secret hierarchies is they're a bit of a paradox, right? You think they're really cool because you know about it and not a lot of people do, but you understand there's a line that you have to go right up to, that a certain amount of people have to keep it going in order to understand the legacy and the importance the role that it played. Because Johnny Thunders and folks like yourself, they contributed a lot to, like you talked about, the sex book from Madonna. If you don't know Mapplethorpe, you won't know, you won't understand that there's a deeper meaning in every single thing that's out there. And everyone that thinks that something is frivolous or something that is just, whatever they want to put a label on it. No, there's many levels deep for anything to get on your radar, to get in your orbit, particularly if you're someone from the Midwest USA and you're from some small town somewhere. If that gets on your radar, there are many artists deep that take place, and writers, in order for that to happen. So let me ask you, now that I've gotten off that rant, that soapbox of mine.
I thought that was very interesting. I think about 30-something years ago, and this is again at a tangent, but it isn't, a guy called David Tibet, who has a band called Current 93, I don't know if you know them, gave me a book by Arthur Machen, who is a supernatural writer. And like the Dolls, like all the things that I've really loved, that book transformed something in my.
Oh, I lost some of your audio. Hello? I lost your audio. Nina? Hello? Oh no. Hello?
Hello?
Oh no, I lost your audio. Are you back?
I'm trying to get back. I don't know why it's gone.
Weird. It might be the fact that it's, we're so far away from each other and it's raining here, and I don't know. Sorry. Please, if you, I'll edit that and clean that up. I wanted to hear. You had me captivated.
Damn. Hang on.
I'm sorry.
Oh. Can you not hear me?
No, I couldn't hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely. I lost all that. I lost. You were going on something really interesting, and then I lost you.
Oh, we can get back to it. Okay, so cool. I don't know what happened there. That was really weird. That was Spirits and Ghosts, I think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, okay, so do you know David Tibet in Current 93?
I don't know David Tibet, no.
Okay, so he is also very interested in sort of supernatural and horror writers of the Victorian era. But he gave me a book by Arthur Machen, The Hill of Dreams, which is about a writer that comes to London to write a masterpiece. And he doesn't. He dies of a laudanum overdose. But Arthur Machen's writing is so transformative and so magical that, again, it had the effect on my soul that the New York Dolls did. And it is very important that anybody anywhere can access these things, these secret hierarchies. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm loving this.
Oh, good.
So
actually, I've thought of something else that I wanted to say. When I started off buying books, I I was a 13-year-old girl, and it was 1973, and I started off reading about secret hierarchy. So
Mm.
I think I had a radar for it. So I loved Jean Genet, and I loved William Burroughs. So anything that was a bit kind of outlaw appealed to me, because that's how I felt about the society that I found myself in.
Yeah, William Burroughs. For folks that don't know, he was very much a part of. It was odd that he was so much involved in these kinds of scenes like that, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe it's not odd. Maybe I'm too far away from it. You might have been, deeper in the orbit to the core talent. So, but for me, I got into William Burroughs because I knew of rock and roll, and I knew of the punk scene at the time, and someone had given me his book Junkie. I read the book. I thought it was really interesting. This is pre-Nirvana era. I thought it was really great. I started to buy all of his work and get really into it. And then I realized that, a lot of musicians were talking about Burroughs, and then that got me into other writers as well. But what is it about William Burroughs and sort of that kind of, it's sort of the way the world is now. He was sort of being that way then, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of explaining it. Again, I think it's just, again, this key to all of this, and you should call it the secret hierarchies, it gave me access to see that beyond the surface of the stifling bourgeois mentality that I was brought up in, was that there were different people living different lives. I mean, the other book that I loved was John Rechy's City of Night. Do you know
Oh my
that?
God, yes. Oh my God, the first time I read that book, I didn't, I'd lived in New York City for a while when my teens, and I thought I'd seen it all, I'd experienced everything, but reading the book was a real shock to my system, and I think it was just the visceral style of his writing. So yes, I did read the book. And also, it was through that secret hierarchy channels of which I got wisps of, but nonetheless, I did read Ritchie's work, and it's a brilliant book. And anybody who, just get a used copy and just read it, please. So,
Um, I mean, it was the best thing that he ever wrote. But it's just interesting because we're in this sort of post aftermath of that, say with RuPaul's Drag Race, and what I find so difficult now is how bland and corporate everything is. You can get a book now of drag names, which means, oh, where the hell is your imagination gone?
hmm hmm and I've got a theory now. I'm gonna debut this theory, and I think you may be able to appreciate this the most. Do you think that the internet has sort of exposed culture too fast? And what I mean is, I came from a not so big city, and when I moved to New York City, it was such a shock to my system because I had to learn about subcultures and things that were going on in New York at the time that I was never exposed to. Now, they were able to create this city culture that wasn't ready to debut to the rest of the country, and it had decades to work on that. Thus, you can produce the punk scene, and when it comes out in its popular form, it's such a shock to middle America. But it's not such a big deal to someone from New York City, London, Los Angeles, where these mega cities. Nowadays, with the internet, you can't have something percolate like that in kind of a pressure cooker city setting, of in each city having its own sort of subculture. It's immediately, as soon as you tweet it out, everyone knows and could know everywhere all over the planet. And before the internet, you would have to be part of that hierarchy like you talked about, or you would have to know it at least existed, or where to go, what clubs to go to, what record stores to go to. You had to sort of get in on the current, so to speak, like you said, sort of ride the distortion or surf the distortion. And my theory is that the reason why it's so bland, like you're talking about, is there's no way to do that privately anymore. And I don't mean like a secret society. I just mean, like someone from New York City before the internet, they had 10, 15, 20 years to work on a subculture before a corporate person picked up on it and tried to capitalize on it.
I mean, I think that you can destroy individuality by making people compete against each other. So it's no longer a scene. Everybody's fighting for that crown, aren't they?
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Just the clicks and the likes and the followers. Yeah, no, you're right. That's a great. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
And they want to please. I mean, I love Jackie Curtis and Candy Darling and Hollywood Lawn, and Trash is one of my favorite films, but I like it because it's documenting the also sort of hard-bitten survival, and they're very funny and they're very challenging. But if you look at influencers now, everybody wants to please and get the deal or whatever, and that takes any of the danger or subversion out of it. Artists, musicians, whatever, should be going up against the status quo and challenging it at every level.
Yeah, that's a really significant insight. And in fact, now that you got me thinking, my wheels are turning. I remember when, and certainly I'm sure you remember when, but I can't speak for you. But I remember when artists, they would, almost be hostile to their audiences, and now that's all but gone. Like you said, everyone is playing to their audience. Everyone is, you know what I mean? And I remember bands being, just, they didn't care if they were late. They didn't care if they weren't in tune. They didn't care if you liked them or not. And that's sort of almost lost, and there were no handlers, so to speak. They were really free agents.
Yeah, well, right, into drag as well. It should be about attitude, not please give me a deal and oh, don't. It just, the whole thing drives me nuts.
And I may, I'm old enough to remember when, if you got a commercial deal for like a car or something like that, that was a mark against you. And now it's like you made it if you get a deal with like an Apple commercial or something like that. And that's not to give a slight to anyone. It's very hard to make money nowadays as a band, and I completely understand that, particularly if you want to make that your living. But I mean, obviously, I'm sure you remember those days when, it was bad enough you did a record deal. It was bad enough that you did a video, but to do commercials or to do anything else like that was just unheard of, particularly for the secret hierarchy that you're talking about.
There's got to be a balance, because you're right. Everybody needs to live. It's nice for everybody to have comfort. Somebody like, the people in the Dolls, they had so little comfort at times. I remember Arthur Kane, the bass player, we used to email, and there was one email where it was heartbreaking. He'd got the cat food for his beloved cats, but he couldn't afford to eat.
Mm-hmm. Oh God. Wow.
This and when you read City of Night or something like that, they are hard luck lives, but they put everything on the line for self-expression.
Yeah. And yeah. That's I don't know, it's just, there's that spirit. It's just not, I don't sense it. And I actively search for that, and I fear it's a technology. I don't think it's a generational thing. I think it's a technology thing, and perhaps, I'm trying to put on my prediction cap. Perhaps something like what you're talking about in particular, perhaps that will be able to be cultivated in the digital space in the future. That sort of spirit of a local scene, the spirit of what you're talking about, that self-expression at all costs, and that self-expression, oftentimes, if it's true and it's real, it's going to go against the grain of what the, whatever power you want to put in. You can call it corporate overlords, you can call it Wall Street, whatever it is you want to call it.
I call it capitalism. I think it's done huge damage.
This certainly, the strain of it that we're particularly in America that we're living in right now. I begrudgingly now I'm in that camp to say yes. I think it's doing a great amount of damage. Yes, and I fear where it may lead to if we stay on this course, particularly in terms of money. But anyway, we're talking bands.
Yes. Let's get back to that. But the bands that you like and the bands that I like were challenging, and that's sort of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So you're chronicling, you're going through your life, you're experiencing just these really interesting and intense things. Um, was there is there any sort of secret hierarchy that you could let me in on, and let people that are listening to our voices now in on, because there's always something that people don't reveal. Is there something in terms of music, or just a moment that you had, or just something that may have even come across in your book that people that might interest them to go out and seek the work? I mean, is there something you can share?
Well, all I can say to you is I'm 60 now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my days of rock and roll are over, apart from those that I loved, and you know who those are. But okay, so the last book that I had published was called Incurable.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a copy of that? You probably don't, and that's fine.
No, I don't. But I have my Kindle, and I ask everyone to go out and get a copy of all your books.
Oh, aren't you sweet? But okay, I'll send you a copy of Incurable. But Incurable is about a Victorian poet, Lionel Johnson. It got some lovely reviews in America. It got reviewed in the Washington Post, for
Mm-hmm.
which I'm very grateful, and the Gay and Lesbian Review. And so my mind, I think what I'm trying to say is my mind is still working the same way, because it's Lionel introduced Lord Alfred Douglas to Oscar Wilde. And he's been marginalized ever since, even by Oscar Wilde fanatics. So I decided that I was going to get his poetry and his short stories republished and write a mini biography of him. So that is Incurable. And maybe I'm incurable with the secret hierarchy.
I was going to say, this fits perfectly with your pattern. What you just described to me is exactly in the same pattern of not exactly, but just the broad stroke, the hue, the concept you're talking about in terms of what Johnny Thunders was to a lot of influential artists who influenced other influencers. What you just expressed to me in terms of your book is exactly in line. So you know how to cut right to the bone of right to it, don't you?
But I also had the help of with that a wonderful publisher called Strange Attractor, whose whole creed de core seems to be secret hierarchies.
Oh, now you have me completely interested. Okay, I'm hooked. I've got to do it. So there you go. I
They put
mean,
out some really, really interesting books. And so what we're saying, there is hope, but you just have to look in the slightly far away corners.
and I think that would be an interesting, because right now on the internet and the interwebs, YouTube, all these people are really into different kinds of subcultures, and they're into alternative histories and things like that. And I think it would do a lot of people a lot of good to read these kinds of alternative histories, because they're real, and I don't mean, I mean real, like they're like from the heart, and they're important, and and keeping these kinds of things alive are important. So you don't have a book like Sex come out and you're just like, it just comes from outer space. Or if you were to listen to Sid Sings, let's say, the live album of Sid Sings, you would say this is god awful. You would.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just trash. However, I still have my copy 20 years on with the poster that it came with, the original copy. And the reason why I still have it, because I understand, like you said, there's an entire pyramid hierarchy of what had to take place in order for that to even happen. And I also understand, musician or not, the idea of Sid Vicious influenced countless people, which influenced a massive amount of American culture, which in turn influenced, America. So it's a secret. It's a secret hierarchy here. It's a secret kingdom that no one knows about, and I think a lot of people just sign it off, and it shouldn't be. And people like you should be read, I think.
Well, look, it's Valentine's Day. We're still talking about it. You found me. So, hey ho, we've done something.
I tell you, that's great. So you said, tell me more about Malcolm McLaren. What else can you tell me about him?
Oh, I think I might have said enough. I think the point has been made. We've had a good chat up till this point, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
But at some future date, we could talk again because
Absolutely.
I had my first novel published, um, which was amazing.
What's the title of your first novel?
The Greenwood Fawn,
Excellent. Excellent.
and it is based on the book that I mentioned, the Arthur Machen book, The Hill of Dreams, about the young poet that comes to London and loses his way in a sort of laudanum haze. For anybody that doesn't know, laudanum was sold in pharmacies in the Victorian era, and it's a mixture of opium and alcohol and was very potent.
Interesting.
You sounded a bit too there. So actually, I found out something very interesting, that if you went into a pharmacy in the Victorian era, if you were a posh person, they'd give you stronger laudanum than if you were a poor person. It's typical, isn't it?
Wow, that's I didn't know that. I knew in the States, at least, I knew heroin and cocaine and everything else was legal up until I think 1911. So that makes perfect sense. I mean, I didn't know that seems like a deadly combination to take an opioid and then alcohol and combine them.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it became the popular choice for suicides for those very reasons. It's an absolutely lethal combo.
Interesting. Interesting in all the wrong ways, but it's nonetheless still interesting.
I think we ignore history on so many levels, again, at our peril.
Yeah, I concur. We've seen this movie before, particularly the opioid epidemic that's happening right now stateside. So yes, we've seen this movie before many times. So okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that I'm not picking up here? Because I'd like to talk to you again. I'd like to get deeper into some of your books, particularly on Johnny. Let me ask you this, and if this is too sensitive, we can cut it out and no one has to hear about it. Do you have an opinion on the death of Johnny Thunders? Because I know that there was some, there's some haze about what happened, particularly because it's New Orleans.
I get asked this a lot. I think there are certain journalists and media people that really like to up the ante on things, even if it isn't true and even if it hurts family and loved ones. Johnny was very ill, and that is the bottom line of it. And I've read the coroner's report. I think the really tragic thing is that there were people around him that night that took advantage of his weakened state, that probably should have called an ambulance, and that ransacked his belongings.
Okay.
But I don't think that he was murdered, and I don't know where this silly LSD story came from. That was in the news the day after Johnny died from somebody that wasn't there. I mean, really, but yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, you can't talk about Johnny Thunders without sort of talking of it. Is a bit of a mystery to some folks. To me, not so much, but it's something you just can't ignore. Particularly, I'm glad you brought up the LSD story because I know it's out there, kind of floating around for folks that are into Johnny Thunders. I certainly knew about it. So yeah, okay.
I don't know where on earth that came from, but Johnny was so ill and he used so many strong drugs. I mean, poor guy, he absolutely crucified himself. So eventually it would take its ultimate toll, and that is what happened. There is no great mystery other than, the people that stole his things coming forward, and they're not likely to come forward.
Right.
And people should not self-aggrandize themselves or make money out of trying to make that bigger.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. And I don't know how to put this, but it's, the way that he passed, I think sometimes if you add a bit of mystery to it, sometimes it does stir it up a bit, and it may sell things. It may, like you said, it may, I don't know, creating something from nothing happens quite a bit, and I think that may be the case here, particularly after talking to you about it. So that's I'm glad you were okay with us covering that. So.
No, it's fine, and I mean, his poor sister was absolutely heartbroken, and the family got a detective to look into things. I mean, certainly it seems like the New Orleans Police Department, all the rest of it, they were pretty shoddy.
Yeah, to say the
But
least.
they could have done more about finding out who stole his stuff, but that doesn't mean that they were hiding a great mystery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
They just, yeah. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time that
Actually, I just wanted to say one more thing.
Sure.
Can people not send me images of themselves outside the guest house where Johnny died? I don't know what it is or why, but people like to go to the St. Peter's guest house or go into the corridors and send me pictures. Why?
Interesting. I don't. That's Send picture of themselves.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I suppose it's almost like death tourism. Now we're going to stand outside the Chelsea Hotel where, Nancy died and all the rest of it. I find it really bizarre.
Yeah, I could see almost like, okay, now that you've put it that way, I've gone on ghost tours and things like that, and if you're not connected to someone or something like that, perhaps it's a bit like that. I suppose I'm trying to kind of contort this into something like that, but I don't know. But the sending of the pictures, that I don't understand that. That must be something like a subreddit out there or something, or some kind of maybe Facebook community. They know why they're doing that or something. Perhaps I'm speculating because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
You know what it is? I think the internet has created a disconnectedness in people. So because they didn't feel something emotionally for somebody, they're not being malicious. They might actually think that I want to see a picture of it, but actually I don't, because I find it distressing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I concur.
Anyway, listen, it was great talking to
Yes.
you.
Yeah, it was, and thank you so much. And I really hope to talk to you again very soon.
Okay, take care. Have a good day, won't you?
Oh, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, Nina, thank you very much for coming on the channel, and I really appreciate this. Now, this is sort of this is my own personal love affair with music, and particularly like glam, punk, anything from the mid 1970s to the late 1980s. I consider that my personal golden age of music, and I think
Mine as well.
yeah,
Mine as well.
okay.
And while I'm remembering it, it would have been Sylvain's birthday
Mm-hmm.
today.
Oh, okay.
He was
So
born on Valentine's Day.
okay, so that's now that's a really interesting factoid there. So let me ask you, let's just, since you brought up Sylvan, how do you feel about this year's inductees to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
I visited the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame actually when I was doing a research trip, and it kind of brought all the things about why we didn't need a corporate Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to mind. Rock and roll doesn't need corporate sponsorship. Rock and roll is something that you feel in your heart. So as far as I'm concerned, the New York Dolls always were in the in one's passionate Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I hate what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame stands for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm deeply saddened that they've asked that it's happened now. The New York Dolls have been voted in when only David Johansen's left alive. I just think that is so sad.
Yeah, I totally understand it. And the thing about it is, the New York Dolls, they influenced the people that influenced pretty much everyone else. So it's they're kind of a, I would consider them a seed band, sort of a core band like MC5, obviously Stooges, and they're even pre that. So I would consider them, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I would consider them probably the antecedent to everything that exploded after that. And I think that's sort of, for people who don't know that kind of history, that seems to be what I would think would be kind of a common understanding of the history. Am I correct in thinking that?
I think you're correct in thinking that. I think they were much more accessible in some ways than, say, the Stooges and the MC5. They were much more fun and frolicsome, and I think there's quite a lot of T-Rex influence in there, Mort Bolan. But yeah, they were incredibly important. They kind of, at the point that the Dolls got going at very early 70s, they blew the cobwebs off rock and roll, which had got very ponderous, apart from, well, the MC5 and the Stooges would they have been on the wane by that point. So the Dolls shook things up a bit, which is what rock and roll is supposed to do. Rock and roll is supposed to be I guess it's supposed to change the direction of youth culture. Youth culture isn't supposed to stay still. It's not supposed to behave itself. It's a series of wrenches and jolts. And that's what the Dolls were. And that's why something corporate like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame actually doesn't have anything to do with it. What, people sitting at their table applauding politely. I mean, I'm sure they'll all get up and jump when they say the New York Dolls name, because 45 years later, it's okay to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This would have made Kane, Arthur and Sylvain and Johnny and Jerry so happy. But I mean, Johnny and Jerry were considered the troublemakers. They got up the corporate nostrils, so to speak, so they wouldn't have been allowed in there. And more power to them, because rock and roll is supposed to be for the misfits and the outsiders, not for people that were acceptable or, I don't know. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, I know what you mean. So you brought up Johnny, and so Johnny Thunders, I mean, personally, I loved the New York Dolls, and I particularly loved Johnny Thunders. I loved everything that, the whole package of what he was. Singer-songwriter, excellent music. The idea of being an influencer before anybody knew what an influencer was. The sort of musician's musician. Like, you had to go at least 2 or 3 levels deep in your music to even know who Johnny Thunders was. And that's not to put a slight against Johnny Thunders. It's sort of like, almost like a hierarchy in terms of talent and in terms of power. And so what can you tell me, for those folks who haven't read anything of yours, what can you tell us about, your interactions with Johnny Thunders, what you think about Johnny Thunders, just anything you can throw out there?
Well, I guess that if the Dolls were this great turning point in rock and roll's development, then Johnny was kind of the guitarist that did much the same. I mean, there's sort of, what you said about being the guitarist, that's very true. But it's a secret hierarchy, and Johnny, I think, was the king of a secret hierarchy. And I also, I've put this in articles, in many ways he was like a James Dean figure. So the live fast, die young thing, unfortunately, he lived that and died that, and he was that in his soul. He was an incredibly poetic character. I think, when you look back in history and you look back at the sort of wilder talents, say like Rimbaud, the French poet, they are unnerving people to meet because they push boundaries. But when you finally come into contact with them, it's like lightning. He was incredibly charismatic, Johnny.
Interesting. So, what could you share about just like you just mentioned about him, being in his presence and the whole lightning in the bottle kind of situation. What kind of interactions would you be comfortable in sharing, or for the folks out there that may not be? I'm trying to draw people to Johnny Thunders and this kind of music.
I think what's difficult to explain, say, with the Doors, everybody knows, because there's footage and because there's